I chose this clip from the movie First Night as Richard Gere plays Lancelot. In that last few sentences, he describes desperation when it comes to fighting, especially wrestling God for blessing. It's holding on to our sword. We believe that the sword of the Spirit is the Word of God, and many Christians are ineffective because we've dropped our swords. But it's holding on to the sword. It's knowing our enemy. And it's not caring whether we live or die. It's being desperate enough to say, no matter the outcome, I'm going to fight to the end. It's desperation. We'll do anything to not be desperate. We'll go to any length and any measure. And we do all that we can to hide desperation. We don't want to be seen as someone who is desperate, because in the culture we live in, that's incredibly, incredibly negative. We all want deliverance, but we don't want the desperation that goes along with it. Fortunately, that's just not how it works. You see, desperation always precedes deliverance. It's only when we are humble and humble enough to be vulnerable that God truly works in our lives. I confess this to the first group, and I will confess it to you as well. This is the third in a 5-part series called Desperate. And I have to admit, I'm incredibly underwhelmed. I'm underwhelmed with my ability to present these lessons, and I'm underwhelmed with the response that I'm seeing in our church. It's not that you don't say nice things. People always say nice things because really you're nice people. But I'm not seeing real desperation. I don't see the person who is willing to do whatever God wants them to do in order to honor Him in their life. I don't see this desperation. To be honest, the most desperate people I see are the ones who are trying to leave to get to their car so that they can get to the restaurant first. Maybe that's desperation. But I can tell you this. In any battle and in any fight, the most dangerous person is the one who has nothing to lose and is desperate. Because if you find someone who's trapped, their back's against the wall, and they have nothing to lose, and they feel a true sense of desperation, they are always dangerous to their opponent. And I come to tell you this, and I say all this to say this. Satan has nothing to fear from a church that's not desperate. Satan is not afraid of a group of people who are not desperate for God. And we need to humble ourselves and allow ourselves to be vulnerable so God can work out and through us. In the New Testament, the Old Testament, when we see desperate moments, there's one phrase that always comes to the top. In the Old Testament, when Israel's back was against the wall and there was nowhere else to turn, they always cried out to God. In the New Testament, when people were broken and they were hurting and they were in desperate need, they always cried out to Jesus. And I don't know if you've ever cried out, but when we cry out, it just sounds different. There's a different tone. It can't be rehearsed. You don't hear crying out in recited and practiced prayer. It comes naturally. When someone cries out and you see someone truly crying out, they're not concerned with their image and they're not concerned with appearances. All they're concerned with is deliverance. And deliverance is only preceded by desperation. This morning, we're going to talk about a very desperate man. He was the son of Isaac and Rebekah, two very famous characters in the Old Testament. And he had a brother. His brother's name was Esau. Now, a lot of people, when they talk about Jacob and his brother Esau, they read through it and they kind of gloss over the text, and they don't realize that they're twins. You know, Esau seems from the text to be much older, much more mature than Jacob. But the reality is that Esau was only minutes older than Jacob. But the problem that arises is that because he's the oldest, eventually when Isaac is going to pass from this world, he would receive the blessing and the birthright from his father. And that's something that the younger son Jacob desperately wanted. You know, when I think of people, though, who would stand and fight, and we start talking about fighting for God's blessing, and someone who would be a real fighter, Jacob is the last person in the Old Testament that comes to mind. Because that's really not his nature. We look in Genesis chapter 25 and verse 27, and it talks about the boys. So when they grew up, Esau was a skillful hunter, a man of the field. And Jacob was a peaceful man, living in tents. What it's saying here is it's saying Esau was a manly man. He hunted and he fished. And he was strong, and everyone that looked at him had no problem believing and maybe even fearing Esau. But Jacob kind of liked to stay home. Probably liked to cook, clean the house, stay in the shade. It affected how their parents saw them. In verse 28, it says that Isaac loved Esau because he had a taste for game. But Rebekah loved Jacob. Isaac loved Esau because he was a manly man. He was the son that men want. But Rebekah, she had her boy too. He was kind of a mama's boy. I'm kind of a mama's boy too. You know, Jacob is known as a manipulator. You read his story, you see comments that are passive aggressive. And even his name means deceiver. Trickster is the literal term. And he wanted this birthright from his brother desperately. So what does he do? You're probably aware of the story. If you haven't read it, you'll find it in Genesis 25 all the way through 32. It's a great story to end Genesis. But in this story, he wants this blessing. And so he and his mother devise a plan that because Esau was different, and there were never two twins more different than Esau and Jacob, that Esau was hairy. That's a weird thing to bring out in Scripture. But it plays into the plot because they put fur on Jacob because Isaac's sight was failing him. And so when he came for the blessing, Isaac couldn't tell the difference. He felt of him and he felt the hair and he thought that it was his son Esau. So he blessed Jacob instead. Now, there's a side note here that's important to this story. Jacob did not want the birthright and the blessing because of the money. Jacob wanted the blessing, not the birthright. You see, all of his life, Jacob had heard his father say, "Have you heard about my son Esau? Hear about all the deer he killed? My son Esau went down the brook and he caught 52 fish. The smallest one weighed a pound. My son Esau is strong and he is mighty." And Jacob was sick of hearing about it. Just once, only once, he wanted his father to say, "Jacob, you matter. Jacob, you're important." And even if he had to trick his father, he just once wanted to hear, "Son, I bless you." And so he receives the blessing. And Esau hears about it. It's kind of interesting. Jacob was so not a fighter, so a tent dweller, that when he steals the birthright for a bowl of soup, you remember that story? Jacob actually made the soup. That's who Jacob was. But finally, Esau goes to his father, and he's heartbroken because he finds that his father had given away his birthright and his blessing to this younger brother by minutes, Jacob. And the conversation goes like this. In chapter 27, verse 35 and 36, it says that he said, "Your brother came deceitfully, and he has taken away your blessing." And then he said, "Is he not rightly named Jacob?" Remember, it means deceiver, trickster. "For he has supplanted me these 2 times. And he took away my birthright, and behold, now he has taken away my blessing. And he said, have you not reserved a blessing for me? And we look in those verses of Scripture, and for me, it just cries out, because what's happening is that Esau is going to his father and says, I know Jacob's a trickster, and I know he's rotten, and I know you gave him the birthright, and I know that you gave him the blessing, but really what's important, didn't you leave some blessing for me? Oh, I know you've always talked about me, and I know you've always loved me more than you do my brother, but now it counts. And when it really counts, don't you love me? And I can imagine how heartbroken he is. And what I also know is that Jacob knew his brother. He knew this hunter. He knew this valiant man. And he knew that he was not going to let this go. So what does Jacob do? He does what Jacob does best. He ran. He took whatever he could hold in his arms, and he took off, and he went to his uncle, Laban. And as the story goes on, we find out that Laban gives him a taste of his own medicine. That Laban is just as big a trickster as the trickster Jacob ever thought about being. And Jacob falls in love with his daughter, Rachel. And so he asks, how can I get her hand? Well, you have to work 7 years for my daughter. And so he works 7 years. And on the morning after the wedding, he finds out that he did not, in fact, marry Rachel. He married Leah, and I guess after 7 years of waiting, you wouldn't notice whether it was Rachel or Leah that night. I don't know. But then he goes and said, well, you've tricked me. Well, the oldest daughter gets married first. If you would like to have Rachel, you have to work 7 more years. And I've always laughed about this, because it's like 14 years for a woman? I'd have told him, you can keep Rachel. And you can keep that weak-eyed Leah too. I say that, but I've been working for the same woman for 33 years. So he stays, and he works, and he gets Rachel. And then Jacob has the last laugh, so to speak. He steals the best of the livestock of his uncle Laban and his father-in-law, and he does what he does best. He runs. He heads west. And on this journey, he finds that he is about to run smack dab into Esau. So he sends 2 servants ahead. He sends some stuff in order to appease his brother. Maybe he'll make him happy. And what the interesting part of this is that he had stolen a blessing from his brother. He had stolen stuff from his uncle and his father-in-law. And now he was going to take the stuff that he stole from his father-in-law and give it to his brother. None of it was ever his. And so he sends them ahead, and they come back to him, and they have a message for him. Chapter 32, verses 6 and 7 says, the messenger returned to Jacob saying, we came to your brother Esau, and furthermore, he is coming to meet you. And 400 men with him. Then Jacob was greatly afraid and distressed, and he divided the people who were with him, and the flocks and the herds and the camels into 2 companies. This was not the news he was hoping for. He was hoping he could send junk that belonged to someone else and that his brother would be appeased. But now his brother's coming toward him and he's bringing 400 men. Do you think he might be a little bit afraid? So he divides his family up into 2 different bands. He's going to send them on ahead, see what happens to them, and then he'll decide what he's going to do. But here's his problem. He's trapped. Laban's behind him. Esau's in front of him. And everywhere that Laban's not, and everywhere that Esau is not, God is. And so he camps that night. Jacob's alone. But we're never alone, because God's there with him. We get to the text. The text is found in chapter 32, verses 24 through 29. And we're going to read this. It says, Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. And when he saw that he had not prevailed against him, he touched the socket of his thigh, and the socket of Jacob's thigh was dislocated, and while he wrestled with him. And then he said, let me go, for the dawn is breaking. But he said, I will not let you go unless you bless me. And so he said to him, what is your name? And he said, Jacob. And he said, your name shall no longer be Jacob, but Israel. For you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed." Then Jacob asked him, he said, "Please tell me your name." But he said, "Why is it that you ask my name?" And he blessed him there. I don't sound like much of a story. It's a pretty cool story, though. Because this angel of the Lord that he wrestles with, most people who know more about the Bible than I do will tell you that might be one of the occurrences that Jesus shows up in the Old Testament. This is God himself that Jacob is wrestling with. But as the story starts, Jacob's alone. And Jacob's like all the rest of us. We don't do alone really well. Alone, quiet, silence, that's not what we're good at. There was a study done not long ago, and it was about cell phones. And basically the study asked people how many times a day, the study was how many times a day do you check your cell phone when you're alone to see if someone's going to contact you or whatnot. And that the average person who owns a cell phone checks their phone 221 times a day. Dude, we don't do alone really well. And Jacob didn't do alone very well either. The beauty of it is if we'll sit still long enough, the same thing that happened to Jacob will happen to us. God just might tackle us. And that's a good thing. We spend so much time running away from things that we never run toward anything. And we miss God by running away from our stuff instead of toward our blessing. We miss out on who God is and what God means and how he works in our life because we're so busy running away from stuff, even running away from being alone. And you can't run from alone. I've tried. That we have no context in what it means to run toward something that really matters. I read a book not long ago called A Disguised Blessing, or Grace Disguised, excuse me. And it was by a guy named Gene Sitzer. The book is about how Gene Sitzer coped with loss. He had been in an automobile accident, and in that accident he had lost 3 generations of women in his life. He had lost his mother, lost his wife, and he had lost his daughter. And as he dealt with coping with all those things, he spent a lot of time trying to run away from that, to hide that, and he realized that there was only one real way to deal with his desperation. In the book, he writes this. He says, "The quickest way for anyone to reach the sun and the light of day is not to run west, chasing after the setting sun, but to run east, plunging into the darkness until one comes to sunrise." And you know, when we're at our most desperate time, what I see more times than not are people who are willing to run west. They want to run away from the consequences of their life. They want to run away from the relationships that are not working instead of turning around and running headlong into the darkness until light comes. And going through the pain in order to receive the blessing, because in every moment of desperation, there's a gift. And Jacob found his blessing when he stopped running. Jacob found his blessing when there was nowhere else to turn. He was totally surrounded, and he finally had to sit still and deal with God. I love this story because there's 2 things that Jacob got out of this story, that he got out of this interaction with this angel of the Lord. The first thing he got was that Jacob was blessed. He finally got the blessing. You see, Jacob had always prayed, but he prayed to the God of Abraham and Isaac. You know, when you're praying to someone else's God, it doesn't feel real personal to you. And I dare say most people in this room at some time have prayed and felt like it wasn't real personal. But at this point, he's alone. At this point, he's trapped. At this point, there's Esau there, there's Laban there, and he has nowhere else to turn. And now God becomes personal. And so he prays a personal prayer. He becomes a personal person with God. And so he's blessed. What was his blessing? Was it wealth? Was it power? No. His blessing is he got a new name. I know we don't think that's much of a blessing. But with his name, he got a change of identity. See, his name had always been Trickster. His always named Deceiver. But the angel says, no, your name is going to be Israel. And the name Israel means triumphant with God. It means you're victorious when you're with God. And it's a name that the nation would never forget, because it would always be on their lips, and the nation would be named for him. Triumphant with God. The blessing he craved, the blessing he wanted from his father Isaac, who never seemed to think he measured up. The blessing he wanted from Laban, the one who raised the daughter that he loved with all his heart, that he never really got. Only God gave that blessing. He finally had it. And I'm willing to say there are people in this room, you've been looking for blessing. You've been desperate for blessing. I don't know where it's from. Maybe it's blessing from a spouse or a parent, child, boss, friend. You're desperate for someone to tell you, you know what, you matter, and you're a priority to me. You're important in my world. And I can tell you that just like Jacob, you may never get it from them, but if you'll seek God, you'll always get it from him. The blessing of God is always God himself. And this blessing never lets us stay the same. Now, we read this text and we think that Jacob defeated this angel of the Lord. That's not what happened. In the text it says that you have fought against God and man and you have prevailed. But that word prevailed doesn't mean that he won. It just means that he lasted all 16 rounds. That's what it means. It means that he was, after it was over, he was still alive and he was still standing. And when we're desperate, that's all we can hope for sometimes, isn't it? That when this is all over, that we'll still be standing. But you know how he won? This is the best part of the story. You don't remember anything else. Remember what I told you this. You know how he won? He grabbed hold of God and he didn't let go. That was all there was to it. The angel of the Lord said, let me go. The day is breaking. He says, I will not let go until I get a blessing. And that's a good place to be. For those of us who are desperate, for those of us who need blessing, we need to grab a hold to God and not let go. Because it is only in that we'll find real blessing. Second thing, not only was he blessed with a new name, he was blessed with a limp. I know that don't sound like a blessing, does it? But he was blessed with a limp. It's kind of interesting. It tells that the angel of the Lord touched his hip and it was dislocated. And actually the terminology that's being used there is like if you snuck into a room behind someone and you didn't want to startle them and they weren't aware you were there, you would reach out and just lightly tap their shoulder. The angel of God tapped his hip and broke it. But you have to understand that was a blessing. Because every limp and every scar are given to us with a built-in story. You think Jacob told anybody about what happened that night? I mean, can't you imagine him going back to his family after all this has happened and he's hobbling back and they're looking at him and saying, well, Jacob, what happened to you? By the way, I'm not Jacob, I'm Israel. And let me tell you this story. You think he told it? Because I think he told it hundreds of times. I mean, we've all got that friend, right? That friend who has that scar or that limp or whatever it is, and they love to tell you a story. They probably told you the story numerous times. They probably told the story hundreds of times to the point that all their friends are tired of hearing about it. But you know what? He's not tired of telling it. Why? Because in that scar, in that limp, is a story of great blessing. And every one of those scars and every one of those limps are given to us with a built-in story. Because these stories are powerful for others who are hiding their limp and covering their scars. They need to hear these stories. Everyone in this room fits into two categories. I don't care who you are. You may not want to admit it. You may leave here saying that I've lost my mind, which is way beside the point. But everybody in here either is someone who needs to stop running and finally wrestle with God and to grab him and hold on. Or you've already been there and you've got a limp and the story that goes with it. And you either need to hang on to God or you need to stop hiding your limp. And I don't know which one it is. But I can tell you this. Both of them are a product of desperation. And Satan will never fear a church that is not desperate. Guys, I want you to know that if you haven't grabbed on to him and held on, you can do it, and you can do it with confidence. The Hebrew writer writes this in Hebrews 4:16. He says, "Therefore let us draw near with confidence to the throne of grace so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in a time of need." If you're desperate for God, grab on and hold on.